Kai Falkenberg.
Hi, everyone. As Justin said, I'm the first Deputy Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, and our agency is delighted to be again sponsoring the New York City Media Lab. This summit has always been a highlight for us, and it's such a wonderful way for us to learn not just about the latest technologies in digital media, but about the broader policy issues that some of those new technologies pose for all of us, as we did with the session just before. And with that in mind, we are thrilled to have our next keynote speaker, Maya Wiley. Maya was formerly the counsel for Mayor Bill de Blasio and responsible for the city's broadband strategy. Currently, she's the SVP for Social Justice here at the New School and the Henry Cohen Professor of Public and Urban Policy and founder of the Digital Equity Lab here. You can find many more of her illustrious accomplishments in your program. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Maya Wiley. And just a short note, after her remarks, we're going to have a brief conversation to discuss her remarks in greater detail.
Thank you, Kai. So I had a really hard time thinking about what I was going to say to you. And in part because you're obviously such an engaged and innovative and smart audience, and there's so many things you know that I don't. And I'm comfortable with that, by the way. But also just hearing some of the conversation on the panel before I came out, and a conversation that Justin Hendricks and I had started in the green room also shifted everything I'm going to say. Sorry about that, because now you're my guinea pigs. Justin and I talked about it, and I said, well, obviously I'm going to speak about digital equity. I founded a digital equity laboratory here at the New School, which is a really exciting opportunity to think about how students and faculty come together across discipline in order to think about what innovation looks like given how rapid technology is changing society and what it means to be people who can disrupt inequality as a result of not being technologists, right? I mean, in other words, we don't have a software engineering school. This is not, we have designers, we have design strategists, we have public policy students, we have international affairs students, we have all the social sciences. So I, having worked for the mayor of the city of New York, thinking about how you extend universal broadband access in a city where literally, depending on which research studies you look at, we have anywhere from 22 to maybe 27% of our population who don't have broadband at home, right? And so these kind of access questions, I don't use the term digital divide. I think that is now, but only because it misses the critical importance of a lot of the things that you're talking about today and have already started talking about this morning, which is how we have tremendous access issues, but the access issues are fundamentally about our inequalities and how we drive them. And technology has already gone beyond the fact of access to all the applications of technology. So we can't just think about it as a divide, right? We can't just think about it as critical to think about access, but not sufficient only to think about access. And so okay, that was my little preface. So Justin and I in the back, I'm going to out Justin. I'm outing you, Justin, but I think he would say this publicly. But we were talking about where we are in the country, right? Donald Trump is president. We're seeing issues about whether or not there was collusion with Russia, with the Trump campaign. Several of the conversations you were having earlier feeding into this question about what technology is doing in terms of driving and micro-targeting, the data that's used for that, where the data comes from, and how it's utilized. All really critically important conversations in terms of our context as a country right now, and also what the technology does and how it could be used for good or ill. But we start having this other conversation about the way in which we have deep economic insecurity and economic divides. And Justin started talking about that, how that critically shapes so much of the problems we have, the tensions, how this past election went. And it may shock some of you to know, said, yes, and race in America. You cannot separate the two. If we go back to this issue of access to infrastructure, to broadband, there are obviously many people who are white in this country who do not have broadband access. They are much more likely, though, to live in rural areas than if you're Black or Latino. Obviously, Native American will be a rural problem as well as an urban problem. But why is that true, right? Why is that true? Obviously, a lot of it is how we as a society have created policies to create the infrastructure in the first place. Many of you may and probably do know that history, but even the fact that we made it privatized in the first place, despite the fact that it started through government R&D, but making it and creating it on business models that made segregated communities of color or rural communities of distance too expensive to serve based on the business model. But what that does is create, again, a reification, a reassertion of how deeply divided we are, because if we've divided our geography and if we divide our opportunities along race and class lines, we will particularly deepen the insecurities around whether and who gets limited pieces of the pie, right? And that started this whole debate in the back room about, well, there are many people who are white and wealthy in this country and highly educated who voted for Donald Trump. So that's not a class economic issue, right? That's a race issue. But then there were also many people who were low income, maybe had high school degrees or less, who voted for Donald Trump in rural areas. Here's the thing, because I did the mapping of this after the election. The rural communities that did not vote for Donald Trump were very different in two important respects from the rural communities that did. The ones that did had shrinking manufacturing jobs and an increase in in-migration of Latinos. That's a race and class problem, right? It's not either a race problem or a class problem. Now, we're here talking about digital media and technology, but the reason I think this is so important to say is because it's not just that we have a digital divide, which we do, and we haven't fixed the business model problem of how we created that divide. But we're also going beyond. The technology is moving so fast and is now riding on top of that internet in ways that have moved well beyond even the question only of access. And now we're deeply engaged in the conversation about shaping meaning. Meaning. Every time we have a conversation about whether or not there's collusion with Russia, or what that even, it's a meaning conversation. It's not a fact-based conversation. And it's highly driven by our own experiences in the world. Except here's the thing. Not only have we disinvested or failed to invest in the infrastructure that fundamentally enables us all to participate in technology, it also means we have not invested in the ability of far too many communities of color, of far too many low-income white communities, in particular rural, not exclusively, but in particular, to even be able to participate in making meaning of what is happening in our country and our lives. Fundamentally. Let me give you, I'm not going to give you examples because you could probably think of them yourselves, but it's everything from, if you didn't have the tech, let me back up. How many of you hear the narrative over and over again that the digital divide has closed because we have now seen smartphone penetration for communities of color and across class? How many have heard that narrative? Be honest. Some of you are being shy. Too early? Okay, but that's not completely wrong, right? I mean, The way that technology has advanced to the point where we have a handheld device that now has the power of a laptop computer in so many important ways is not unimportant. Nor is it unimportant that that jump over in some respects has resulted in even penetrating low-income communities of color technically having technology and a powerful device and the ability then to get online. But the ability to transact with that is not the same. And the ability to make meaning with that is not the same. And so we can't just use, this is part of my point about we can't just use our traditional notions of digital divide to actually understand what it means to be connected, to drive meaning, and even to have the conversation that Justin and I had the privilege of being able to have in the green room, right? And to tell the story of even how your meaning gets made and shaped for you if you are a low-income person of color, or even, frankly, sometimes a high-income person of color, versus if you're not, right? And that's even true for low-income white communities who feel so frustrated and whose frustration are really deeply seeping into this notion of meaning-making in terms of what their lives are or what it represents, right? And we're at a time when we're riding on these technological advances on top of the technological divide we never closed, with a little, not unimportant leapfrog, but now this question of, but is the tool the same and does it drive the same thing? And what does it mean to have the tool when we're actually seeing a country that physically is more segregated and is increasing its segregation since the 1960s. And it's a segregation that is both seeing greater concentration of communities of wealth and a greater concentration of communities of color. Because the communities of wealth are more likely to be all white, and the communities of color are more likely to have folks who then become intergenerationally lacking in mobility. There's lots of research behind this, and I won't share it all. But even in our activity spaces, so one really fascinating thing that I'll just share is a recent study by some leading poverty researchers, Robert Sampson, Mario Small at Harvard University. But what they did is, because we do have, right, and y'all know there's Black Twitter. I don't have to tell you that, right? Okay. I'm a fan. I'm addicted. But Twitter data, like using Twitter data because people do have smartphones and because social media is one of the key things that people use their smartphones for across race and class. And they actually looked at everyday mobility patterns based on that Twitter data. And what they found is, and New York is one of the most segregated cities in the country. Does that shock anybody? Yeah? That's a good response, because the truth is we're such a dense city. We feel in such close proximity to one another. It's impossible not to see our diversity, right? And experience it at some level that is very different from other parts of the country. But in terms of our schools, in terms of our housing, in terms of our neighborhoods, we are one of the most segregated cities in the country and regions in the country. And when they looked at that data, what was so not surprising to me, but really important to see, is that most of us, no matter our race or our class, we have very small activity spaces. We don't travel that far. We don't travel to that many other neighborhoods. So we're not just segregated in the physical sense, which we are, but we're not even transcending physical boundary. And then we expect to be able to transcend those deep experiential gulfs between how we live our lives and where we live our lives and what we see into data, where it gets collected, how it gets collected, what it helps us understand about ourselves, and then even a discussion about what that data means. Because so many people can't even participate not only in creating the data, right? If you're only on your smartphone and we're skimming data off smartphones and you're limited in even the amount of time you can afford to pay, you don't have an unlimited data package. Trust. We have people who have smartphones, but they're literally rationing their usage of that smartphone. And more likely to ration it to try to apply for a job online. You have to go online, as you know, to apply now to be a gas station attendant. But you're going to ration that precious data. And then, so what data you're even generating, putting aside the privacy and surveillance issues, because those are really important, but just even the ability to generate a story based on your data is limited. And then the ability to own and control and make meaning of that story is almost non-existent. And so now we come back to the time of Trump. And this isn't about politics, right? I'm just talking about the incredible divisions we see and experience in the country. The fact that we are a post-race, we're not post-race anymore. Thank you, Donald Trump. We're very clear that it's all about race and class. But we are actually post-fact. And everything is about meaning. And we must be able to generate that no matter who we are, what we look like, where we live, and in particular, if we are people of color. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya, for your important remarks on these often overlooked and difficult issues. Unfortunately, we have some time to delve further into a few of them. One of the things you touched upon is the connection between equity in the context of technology. And we're focused here at a summit on the future of digital media, hearing about the most cutting-edge technology and how companies and consumers will be using them in the years to come. And I'm interested to know how you think emerging companies can incorporate these important questions about equity during the innovation process. And are there any incentives to encourage them to do so?
Yeah. So one thing is to say is business models have to change, right? I mean, so technology is moving so, the reason this is such an important question, I'm just going to say why it's an important question first, is because if you look at the history of policy that has advanced how we've done technology in the United States, often it's the way that private sector has shaped its business models that has then driven the policy. In other words, the policy is not driving incentives for how we structure technology. It's actually been the other way around because the private sector then can invest and usually get beyond where government is. So just take internet, fiber build out, right? That's fundamentally businesses were moving faster than governments. So governments sort of figured out, let's just figure out how to franchise, make access so they can get that technology driven faster. So that's the government being responsive to the business models. And so the business models then form the policies. So in this context, if we're going to be about disruption, right? I come from an activist family, so I like the idea of disruption. I just want it to be about inequality. That's the thing I want to disrupt, right? But then we have to think about business models that disrupt the inequality. So this is a small example, because I think this is one of the critically important questions of innovation for startups is how is our business model itself also going to be disruptive, not just whether our technology is disruptive. So one of actually Justin's incubated projects, as students came to me because they had this really fascinating idea of actually doing a digital platform for training police officers to police better and differently, right? So there's a good example of taking technology and saying, hey, how can we take a technological tool, a digital tool, and make it help do some public good, and we can do well at the same time. Well, the issue I said was like, but how, in the design of even what you're designing to train, who are your partners? How is it getting developed? And how are you gonna figure out understanding the actual lived experience of the person who's on the other side of the gun? Or who's on the other side of getting their head bashed into a wall, or thrown to the ground when they got stopped for a traffic violation, ripped out of their car and thrown to the ground. Like, how do you, there's an experiential element to this, and is there then a way to think about how folks actually can participate and benefit in the business model of that, right? So that they're built into the revenue structure in some way. Are they getting paid for their consultancy? Are they getting, some opportunity to think about how that becomes part of the training model so that when the police departments are thinking about buying it, they're also thinking about the consultancies around what makes the tool much more of a lived experience that starts to break down some deeply, deeply psychological and sociological barriers between those who police and those who are being policed. So I just use that as an example, not because it's an answer, but because I think that's a critical way that we have to think differently. And for businesses, and this is where I think the startups are so critically important, and I am going to call out, so for incumbents, I actually think incumbency is a problem politically and in business. Meaning what happens is it gets very hard to become nimble and to shift the business model, right? And so for incumbents, the problem becomes how, based on the incumbency, do you rethink the business model? That's very, very complicated. Innovators who are at startup phase don't have that problem, right? So there's a lot more opportunity to say, how do we actually structure the business model so that there's social benefit in the business model?
Right from the get-go.
Right from the get-go. And the incentive there, and I think we saw this in our Link NYC franchise, which is complicated and hard, but the benefit is we could see in the business model, right, both something that was innovative, something that was going to bring costs down for our low-income communities that are rationing their data on their smartphone, but in a way that added revenue into the public coffers that enabled us to put more money into getting free access for folks in Queensbridge houses, largest public housing development in North America, not even just in New York. But also a business model where it started to create a really collaborative conversation about next levels of social good in terms of the infrastructure that was now going to go into disconnected low-income communities of color. It's just different. It's just a different business model that's now enabling a different set of conversations about investment. And their incentive, their business model incentive is, we will do better if more of these people were disconnected or connected. Because that's our business model, right, is eyeballs. So lots of complication in that. I'm not trying to brush over the complication of that. I see it, I recognize it. But it's the kind of experimentation we have to figure out a way to do while we figure out how to protect people who are more vulnerable and more excluded.
What do you think for the companies that fail to deliver their services equitably, what are the best ways of holding them accountable?
Besides suing them? No, and I actually say that with some seriousness. I was teasing someone I won't name about, my job in government from the mayor was one thing that we could do, one tool we had on accountability was actually to hold the contract obligations of our franchisees and say, no longer are we just going to assume you're telling us the truth. We're going to actually examine it, and if we don't think we're actually getting what you contracted to do, we're going to try to negotiate to figure out how you get it, and if we don't get it, we're going to use the levers of government to say, you breached our contract, right? Now that was new, and that was not our first choice. Let me just be clear about that. Our first choice was to figure out how to negotiate to a successful conclusion for everybody. But I think that this is why I'm actually much more interested in this idea of how do we create innovative collaboration around different business models. So, because it's not about eliminating the private sector, but it is about a private sector that doesn't just think about what it delivers either as charity or as we'll just feel good about what the tool is, right? But that actually sees its participation in a community very differently. I don't remember what your question was, and I don't think I answered it, but I felt good. So.
I think you had it. I think we're actually over our time, so thank you so much.
Thank
we
you.
Appreciate your being here.
Thank you. And anyone who wants to be part of trying to figure this out, we'd love to be in conversation at the Digital Equity Lab, because that's really why we're here, is to have this discussion. So thank you for tolerating it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you.